The first shot rang out at noon, shattering the dusty quiet of Silver Creek just as Xavier Yates stepped onto the boardwalk outside the town's only saloon. He didn't flinch not because he was brave, but because after 3 years riding with the Texas Rangers, gunfire had become as familiar to him as the sound of his own heartbeat. Silver Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1875. A town like 100 others that had sprung up in the wake of the war, half-finished, desperate for prosperity, and teetering on the edge of lawlessness. Xavier had come here trailing rumors of the Blackwater Gang, whose leader had put 2 of his fellow Rangers in early graves back in El Paso. The second shot sent townspeople scattering. Xavier's hand hovered over his Colt as he scanned the street, squinting against the harsh summer sunlight. That's when he saw her, a woman stumbling out from between 2 buildings, her dress torn and dirty, hair falling in tangled waves around her shoulders. Even from a distance, he could see her eyes were wide with terror. A third shot kicked up dirt at her feet. She didn't scream. She didn't make a sound at all. Xavier moved without thinking, crossing the street in long strides. He reached her just as a man emerged from the alley she'd fled, pistol raised. "That's far enough," Xavier called out, drawing his own weapon. "The lady doesn't seem to want your company." The man, unshaven, dressed in clothes that had seen better days, spat into the dirt. "Ain't no lady, just a thief who needs to learn her place." Xavier positioned himself between the woman and the gunman. "Whatever she's done, shooting her in the street isn't the answer." "We have a sheriff in this town." The man laughed, a sound like gravel under boot heels. "Sheriff's 3 days gone to Cheyenne. Now step aside, stranger. This ain't your concern. I'm making it my concern." Xavier didn't raise his voice, but something in his tone made the man hesitate. A tense moment passed, stretched thin as spider silk. Then the man cursed, holstered his weapon, and backed away. "You watch yourself," he warned before disappearing back into the alley. Xavier turned to the woman, who hadn't moved or spoken throughout the entire exchange. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 25, with eyes the color of spring grass after rain. Her face was smudged with dirt, and a bruise was forming along her jawline. "Are you hurt, miss?" he asked. She stared at him, silent. "You have somewhere safe to go." No response. Just those green eyes, wide and watchful. Xavier sighed, holstering his weapon. "Well, I can't leave you standing in the middle of the street." He gestured toward the hotel across the way. "I was heading there myself. At least let me get you a chair to sit in while you gather yourself." She didn't nod, didn't speak, but when he began walking toward the hotel, she followed, keeping a careful distance between them. The few people who had ventured back onto the street after the shooting watched them pass with undisguised curiosity. The hotel lobby was mercifully empty except for the clerk, who looked up from his ledger with disinterest until he spotted the woman. "Now, Mr. Yates," the clerk began, "we run a respectable establishment. The lady needs a place to rest." Xavier cut him off. "And perhaps some water." "She's not water," Xavier repeated, his tone making it clear it wasn't a request. The clerk hesitated, then disappeared into a back room. Xavier guided the woman to a worn armchair in the corner of the lobby. She sank into it, her hands clutching at the fabric of her torn dress. "My name is Xavier Yates," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "I'm passing through town. I don't mean you any harm." Still, she remained silent, those green eyes never leaving his face. The clerk returned with a glass of water, which Xavier accepted with a nod of thanks before offering it to the woman. She took it with trembling hands but didn't drink. "Do you have a name?" Xavier tried again. Nothing. Xavier sat in the chair beside her, removing his hat and placing it on his knee. He was used to silence, had spent months at a time with no company but his horse and the vast emptiness of the frontier. But there was something unnerving about this woman's complete absence of speech. "That man," he said after a while, "is he likely to come looking for you again?" A barely perceptible nod. Progress. "Did you take something from him?" Her eyes flashed with something, anger perhaps, or indignation, but still she didn't speak. "I'm not judging," Xavier continued. "Out here, sometimes survival means doing things we wouldn't otherwise do." He knew that better than most. The badge he'd worn had given him the right to call his killings justice, but in the quiet hours before dawn, the faces of the men he'd shot still visited him. They sat in silence as the afternoon light shifted across the lobby floor. Xavier didn't press her further. If she wouldn't or couldn't speak, badgering her wouldn't help. Instead, he watched the street through the hotel's front window, alert for any sign of the man returning with friends. Evening approached, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple visible through the lobby windows. The woman hadn't moved from her chair, hadn't drunk her water, hadn't made a sound. "I've taken a room here," Xavier finally said, standing and placing his hat back on his head. "Number 12 upstairs. If you need somewhere to stay tonight, you're welcome to it. I can find other accommodations." He placed a room key on the small table beside her chair. No obligation, no expectations, just an offer of a safe place. She looked at the key, then back at him, suspicion evident in the tightness around her eyes. "I'll be getting some supper at the cafe down the street," he added. "If you're hungry, you're welcome to join me. If not, well, the offer of the room stands regardless." He tipped his hat to her and walked out, feeling her eyes on his back the entire way. The cafe was nearly empty, just a couple of local merchants finishing their meals, and a table of cowboys who'd clearly started drinking well before sundown. Xavier chose a table with a clear view of both the door and the street outside, old habits dying hard. He ordered coffee and the daily special without asking what it was. In towns like this, there was rarely more than one option anyway. He was halfway through a plate of surprisingly decent beef stew when the door opened, and the woman from the hotel stepped tentatively inside. Her hair had been smoothed back, and she'd made some attempt to brush the dirt from her dress, though the tear along the side remained. She stood just inside the entrance, eyes scanning the room until they landed on Xavier. For a moment he thought she might turn and leave. Instead, she made her way to his table, her steps careful and measured as if she expected the floor to give way beneath her. Xavier stood as she approached. "Miss," he greeted her, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Please join me." She sat, her posture rigid, hands folded tightly in her lap. "Would you like something to eat?" he asked. She gave a single, short nod. Xavier signaled the waitress, a tired-looking woman with graying hair escaping from her bun. "Another of the same, please, and more coffee." The waitress glanced at the silent woman, then back at Xavier with a raised eyebrow, but she nodded and headed to the kitchen without comment. "I'm glad you decided to come," Xavier said, returning to his own meal. "Though I understand if you prefer to keep your own counsel." He didn't expect a response and didn't receive one. They sat in what might have been awkward silence if Xavier hadn't spent so much of his life comfortable with quiet. The woman's eyes darted occasionally to the door, to the windows, to the other patrons, always watchful, always alert. When her food arrived, she ate with the focused intensity of someone who hadn't seen a proper meal in days. Xavier signaled for another portion without asking, and when it came, she consumed that too, though more slowly. After she finished, Xavier paid for their meals and they walked back to the hotel together as night settled fully over Silver Creek. In the lobby, he stopped. "The room is yours for tonight," he said, nodding toward the stairs. "I've made arrangements at the livery stable. There's a cot there I can use." She looked at him with that same steady, measuring gaze that seemed to be trying to peer into his soul. "No one will bother you," he assured her. "The door locks from the inside." After a moment's hesitation, she reached out and took the key he'd left for her earlier from her pocket, showing it to him before clutching it tightly in her fist. "Good night, then," Xavier said softly. "If you're still here in the morning, perhaps we can figure out what to do next." He turned to leave, had taken 3 steps toward the door when he heard it so faint he almost thought he'd imagined it. "Thank you." 2 simple words, barely above a whisper, spoken in a voice husky from disuse. Xavier froze, then slowly turned back to face her. "You're welcome," he replied, careful to keep any hint of surprise from his voice. She held his gaze for a long moment, then turned and climbed the stairs, disappearing around the corner of the landing. Xavier stood watching the empty staircase, wondering what circumstances had brought this woman to Silver Creek, What had happened to rob her of her voice until now? More importantly, he wondered what kind of trouble followed her and whether, in helping her, he'd invited that trouble to find him too. Outside, the night wind picked up, whistling between the buildings with a sound like distant laughter. Xavier shook off his uneasy thoughts and headed for the livery stable. Tomorrow would bring answers or it wouldn't. Either way, sleep was what he needed now. The stable was warm and smelled of hay and horses. Xavier made himself as comfortable as possible on the narrow cot, his saddle serving as a pillow, his rifle within arm's reach. His last thought before drifting off was of green eyes, and that whispered, "Thank you," the first words from a woman who seemed to carry silence like armor. Morning came with the sounds of Silver Creek awakening wagons rolling down the main street, merchants opening their shops, cowboys stumbling back to their mounts after nights spent drinking and gambling. Xavier rose with the sun, splashed water on his face from the pump outside the livery, and headed to the hotel, uncertain whether the woman would still be there. He found her sitting in the same chair in the lobby where she'd sat the previous day, back straight, hands folded in her lap. She'd done something with her hair, twisting it into a simple knot at the nape of her neck. The torn dress had been replaced by a plain blue one that hung a bit loose on her frame, as if borrowed or purchased secondhand. "Good morning," Xavier greeted her, removing his hat. "Did you sleep well?" She nodded, the movement so slight it was barely perceptible. "I thought we might get some breakfast," he suggested. "If you're amenable," another nod, this one more definitive. She rose from the chair with fluid grace that belied the wariness in her eyes. They walked to the cafe in silence, drawing curious glances from early morning shoppers and storekeepers. Xavier was acutely aware of the picture they made him in his trail-worn clothes and dusty boots, her in her too large dress, neither speaking. But curiosity was the least of his concerns. Over plates of eggs and bacon, Xavier decided a direct approach might be best. "I meant what I said yesterday. I don't mean you any harm, but I'd like to know who that man was and why he was shooting at you." The woman set down her fork and looked at him for a long moment, her gaze evaluating. Then, in that same hushed voice he'd heard the night before, she said, "His name is Darby, Chester Darby." The name meant nothing to Xavier, but he nodded encouragingly. "He believes I took something of his." Her voice grew stronger with each word, as if she were remembering how to use it after a long absence. "Did you?" Her lips pressed together in a thin line. "Yes and no." Xavier waited, sensing there was more to the story that she wasn't ready to share. "My name is Clara," she finally offered. "Clara Keating. It's good to meet you properly, Miss Keating." The correction came quickly, her hand moving instinctively to her left ring finger, which bore no ring. "Mrs. Keating," Xavier amended. "Is your husband here in Silver Creek?" A shadow crossed her face. "No, he's gone." The way she said it, Xavier knew she didn't mean her husband had simply left. "I'm sorry for your loss," Clara nodded, her gaze dropping to her plate. 3 months ago, fever took him in 2 days. "That's a hard thing," Xavier said quietly. He'd seen men face down armed outlaws with less courage than it took to watch a loved one slip away to illness. "It was quick, at least," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the pain evident in her eyes. "Not like—" She trailed off and Xavier didn't press. Instead, he asked, "This man, Darby, is he likely to keep coming after you?" "Yes." The certainty in her voice was chilling. "He's not a man who gives up easily." "What is it he thinks you took?" Clara hesitated, then reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a folded piece of paper. She placed it on the table between them but kept her hand covering it. "My husband worked for the railroad," she explained. "As a surveyor, before he died, he discovered something valuable. Darby was his assistant. When Thomas, my husband, realized what they'd found, he didn't trust Darby with the information, so he hid this." She tapped the paper beneath her hand. "After Thomas died, Darby came to me demanding to know where it was, said Thomas had stolen his discovery, his chance at fortune. When I wouldn't tell him, couldn't tell him, because I didn't know then, he became insistent." The bruise on her jaw suddenly made more sense. "I found this 3 days ago, hidden in the lining of Thomas's field journal. I took it and ran. Darby followed." Xavier studied her face. What is it that's so valuable it's worth shooting someone over in broad daylight? Clara slowly unfolded the paper, revealing what appeared to be a hand-drawn map. Gold, she said simply. A vein that the railroad survey missed, hidden in a canyon about 2 days' ride from here. Thomas suspected it was significant rich enough to make a man wealthy beyond imagining. Xavier examined the map. It was detailed, with landmarks clearly marked and notes in a neat, precise hand. If genuine, it was indeed valuable and dangerous. Why not turn this over to the railroad company? He asked. Surely they have a claim to anything discovered during their survey. Clara's expression hardened. The railroad took my husband's life as surely as the fever did. 16-hour days in all weather, sleeping in tents with no proper provisions. When he fell ill, they didn't even send a doctor until it was too late. She folded the map carefully. I don't owe them anything. Xavier couldn't argue with her logic, nor with the quiet anger in her voice. He'd seen firsthand how the big companies treated their workers as expendable resources rather than men with families and futures. So what will you do with it? He asked. I don't know, she admitted. I just knew I couldn't let Darby have it, not after. She touched her bruised jaw unconsciously. Xavier nodded, understanding, filling in the gaps she left unspoken. He'll keep looking for you. Yes, and if he finds you again, he won't be shooting at your feet. Clara met his gaze steadily. No, he won't. Xavier considered their options, limited as they were. The smart thing would be to walk away. This wasn't his fight, and getting involved with a gold map and a vengeful pursuer wasn't what he'd come to Silver Creek for. But the thought of leaving Clara to face Darby alone didn't sit right with him. I came to this town tracking men who are far more dangerous than your Chester Darby, he said finally. Outlaws who have left a trail of bodies across 3 territories. Finding them is my priority. Something like resignation crossed Clara's face, but she nodded. I understand. You've already done more than most would. I can manage from here. I didn't say I was leaving you to manage alone, Xavier clarified. Only that my business here isn't finished, and it occurs to me that traveling together might benefit us both, safety in numbers, as they say. Clara looked suspicious. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Yates? I need to continue my investigation in town for another day or two. During that time, you stay in the hotel room out of sight. Then we leave together, you to wherever you think is safe, me to continue my hunt. At least until we're far enough from Silver Creek that Darby won't find you easily. And what do you want in return? She asked, wariness evident in every line of her body. Nothing, Xavier replied honestly. Except perhaps the knowledge that I didn't leave a woman alone to face a man who's already shown he's willing to hurt her. Clara studied him, searching his face for any sign of deception. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because after a long moment she nodded. 2 days, she agreed. Then we leave whether your business is concluded or not. 2 days, Xavier confirmed. Now let's get you back to the hotel before Darby spots you. As they left the cafe, Xavier scanned the street with heightened awareness. Silver Creek was busier now, the morning well underway. Across the street, he spotted a man watching them, not Darby, based on Clara's description, but someone whose interest seemed more than casual. Don't look, Xavier murmured, placing a hand lightly at Clara's elbow to guide her. But I think we're being observed. Clara kept her gaze forward, but he felt her tense beneath his touch. Is it Darby? No, someone else, could be nothing, but let's not take chances. They quickened their pace slightly, and Xavier guided them on a less direct route back to the hotel, taking side streets and alleys. When they reached the hotel's back entrance, he glanced behind them. No sign of the watcher. Stay in the room, he instructed as they climbed the stairs. Lock the door, I'll bring food later. Where are you going? Clara asked. To see a man about the Blackwater Gang, Xavier replied, and to find out if your friend Darby has any connections in town that might make our departure complicated. In the hallway outside room 12, Clara paused with the key in her hand. Be careful, Mr. Yates. Darby isn't the type to work alone, Xavier nodded. I rarely underestimate desperate men, Mrs. Keating. It's a good way to end up dead. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Then we understand each other. She unlocked the door and slipped inside, the decisive click of the lock following immediately. Xavier stood for a moment, contemplating the closed door and the woman behind it. In just 24 hours, he'd gone from pursuing outlaws to planning an escape with a widow carrying a gold map. Life on the frontier had a way of taking unexpected turns. With a sigh, he headed back downstairs and out into the bright Wyoming morning. He had questions that needed answers, and time was running short. The saloon where Xavier had been standing when he first heard gunshots seemed the logical place to start gathering information. Despite the early hour, several patrons were already nursing drinks at the scarred wooden bar. The bartender, a barrel-chested man with an impressive mustache, looked up as Xavier entered. "Bit early for you, isn't it?" the bartender asked, recognizing Xavier from his previous visits. "Just looking for information today, Hank," Xavier replied, leaning against the bar. "What do you know about a man named Chester Darby?" Hank's eyebrows rose. "Darby, nasty piece of work, was with the Railroad Survey until a few months back. Now he does odd jobs, mostly for Wade Simmons over at the assay office. The man I saw yesterday seemed pretty intent on catching a woman who he claimed stole from him." Hank snorted. "That'd be the Keating widow, I expect. Poor thing hasn't had an easy time of it since her husband passed. Darby's been hounding her for weeks, claims she's got something rightfully his." "And what do you think?" Xavier asked, sliding a coin across the bar. Hank pocketed the money with practiced ease. "I think Darby's a snake who'd say anything to get what he wants. Thomas Keating was a decent sort, used to stop in here for a drink after long days in the field. Whatever's between his widow and Darby, I'd put my money on her being in the right. Darby have many friends in town." "Friends, no." Hank leaned closer, lowering his voice. "But he's tight with Simmons, and Simmons has connections to some unsavory types passing through. Word is he handles certain transactions that wouldn't bear official scrutiny." Xavier nodded thoughtfully. "Any of those unsavory types happen to be the Blackwater Gang?" Hank's eyes widened slightly. "Now, there's a name best not spoken too loud around here, but yes, there's been talk. Simmons met with some men out at his claim about a week ago. Description matches what I've heard of the Blackwater boys." This was the first solid lead Xavier had found since arriving in Silver Creek. If Wade Simmons was doing business with the Blackwater Gang, that connection might explain why they'd been seen in the area. "Where can I find this Simmons?" Xavier asked. "Assay office during the day. He's got a claim a few miles north of town where he stays most nights." Hank straightened up as the batwing doors swung open, admitting more customers. "Watch yourself if you're asking questions about him. Man's got a temper and doesn't mind using it." Xavier thanked him and left, his mind working through this new information. If Darby worked for Simmons, and Simmons had connections to the Blackwater Gang, Clara's gold map might be even more dangerous than she realized. The Blackwater Gang had a reputation for eliminating anyone who stood between them and potential wealth. The assay office was a small brick building near the bank. Xavier approached cautiously, surveying the street before entering. Inside, a thin man with spectacles was examining a sample of ore. He looked up as the door closed. "Help you?" he asked, setting aside his tools. "Looking for Wade Simmons," Xavier replied. "He's out at his claim today, won't be back till tomorrow." The man peered at Xavier over his spectacles. "You a prospector?" "No, just have some business to discuss." The clerk seemed uninterested in pressing further. "You can find his claim following the north road about 3 miles. Can't miss it, got a red painted water wheel by the creek." Xavier nodded his thanks and left, considering his next move. Visiting Simmons at his claim might provide answers about the Blackwater Gang, but it would mean leaving Clara alone longer than he liked. The smart play would be to gather what supplies they needed for their journey and wait until tomorrow to confront Simmons. As he crossed the street toward the general store, Xavier spotted a familiar figure, the man who had been watching them outside the cafe. He was leaning against a hitching post, smoking a cigarette, his attention seemingly on nothing in particular. But as Xavier approached, the man straightened and moved off with deliberate casualness. Xavier changed direction, following at a distance. The man led him on a winding path through town, eventually entering a dilapidated boarding house on the outskirts of Silver Creek. Xavier waited a few minutes, then approached the building, circling around to the back where a line of washing hung drying in the sun. A woman was pegging up sheets, humming to herself. She startled when she noticed Xavier. "Didn't mean to frighten you, madam," he said, tipping his hat. "I'm looking for a man who just came in tall fellow, brown coat, has a scar above his right eye." The woman relaxed slightly. "That'd be Miller, second floor room at the end of the hall." She looked Xavier up and down. "He in some kind of trouble?" "Not with me," Xavier assured her. "Just need to ask him a few questions." The woman shrugged and returned to her laundry. "Stairs are through the kitchen. Mind the third step, it creaks something awful." Xavier thanked her and made his way inside, avoiding the third step as advised. The boarding house was quiet at this hour, most of its occupants likely at work. He climbed to the second floor and moved silently down the hallway to the end room. No sound came from within. Xavier knocked firmly. "Who is it?" a gruff voice called. "Man with questions about Chester Darby," Xavier answered, figuring directness might yield results. Silence, then the sound of movement. The door opened a crack, revealing the man Xavier had followed Miller with one hand suspiciously out of sight, likely holding a weapon. "Don't know any Darby," Miller said, his eyes narrow with suspicion. "That's interesting," Xavier replied calmly, "considering you've been watching me and Mrs. Keating since breakfast, and Darby seems mighty interested in her whereabouts." Miller's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Don't know what you're talking about, mister. Now clear off before there's trouble." Xavier moved faster than Miller anticipated, shoving the door open with his shoulder and forcing the man back into the room. As expected, Miller had a revolver, but Xavier seized his wrist before he could bring it to bear. "Let's try again," Xavier said, twisting until Miller grunted in pain and dropped the weapon. "What's your interest in Mrs. Keating?" "None," Miller gasped as Xavier increased pressure on his wrist. "I was paid to watch her, that's all." "By Darby?" "No, by Simmons. Said she had something that belonged to him, wanted to know where she was staying, who she was talking to." Xavier released Miller's wrist but kicked the fallen revolver under the bed, out of reach. "Why's Simmons interested in Clara Keating?" Miller rubbed his wrist, glaring. "Don't know details. Just that her husband found something valuable during the railroad survey and Simmons wants it. Paid Darby good money to get it from her after Keating died. And when Darby failed, Simmons decided to take a more direct approach, something like that." Miller's eyes darted to the door, calculating his chances of escape. "Don't," Xavier warned, seeing the thought form. "I'm faster than you, and unlike Simmons, I don't pay for my dirty work." Miller slumped onto the edge of the bed. "Look, I'm just doing a job, nothing personal against the woman. When's Darby expecting your report?" "Sundown. Meeting him at Simmons' claim," Xavier nodded. This confirmed his suspicions. Darby, Simmons, and possibly the Blackwater Gang were all connected and all interested in Clara's map. The situation was more dangerous than he'd initially thought. "Here's what's going to happen," Xavier said, his voice level. "You're going to pack your things and leave town, today. If I see you anywhere near Mrs. Keating or hear you've been talking to Darby or Simmons, our next meeting won't be as pleasant." Miller looked like he might argue, then thought better of it. "Fine. I was getting tired of this dust bowl anyway. One more thing," Xavier added as he backed toward the door. "What do you know about the Blackwater Gang being in the area?" A flash of genuine fear crossed Miller's face. "Those animals, nothing I want any part of. But Simmons has been meeting with them, planning something big, from what little I've overheard, something about a shipment coming through next week." This was valuable information, exactly what Xavier had come to Silver Creek to find. But now it was tangled up with Clara's situation, making a clean resolution unlikely. "Remember what I said," Xavier warned as he left. "I see you again, you won't walk away so easily." He retrieved Miller's revolver from under the bed, emptied the chambers into his pocket, and tossed the weapon back. No sense leaving a man completely defenseless in these parts, but no reason to leave him armed either. Outside, Xavier moved quickly through town, heading back to the hotel. The pieces were falling into place, and none of them painted a promising picture. If Simmons was working with the Blackwater Gang and was also after Clara's map, waiting until tomorrow to leave might be too risky. As he approached the hotel, Xavier spotted a familiar figure across the street, Chester Darby himself, watching the building with the focused intensity of a predator. Darby hadn't noticed Xavier yet, giving him the advantage of surprise. Xavier crossed the street casually, as if heading to the general store. When he was directly behind Darby, he spoke quietly. "Afternoon, Darby." The man spun around, hand dropping to his sidearm, but Xavier was prepared. He caught Darby's wrist, twisting it painfully as he backed the smaller man into the narrow space between buildings. "Easy now," Xavier cautioned. "We're just having a friendly conversation." "Who the hell are you?" Darby snarled, struggling against Xavier's grip. "Someone who takes exception to men who beat women and shoot at them in the street." Xavier increased pressure until Darby stopped struggling. "I understand you're looking for Mrs. Keating." "That's my business," Darby spat. "She's a thief." "Funny thing about theft usually requires taking something that doesn't belong to you. From what I hear, what she has belonged to her husband." Darby's eyes narrowed. "Keating stole my discovery. I'm the one who found that vein, not him. He just took the credit." "That's so." "Then why didn't you report it to the railroad company yourself?" A flicker of something guilt, perhaps, or simply calculation crossed Darby's face. "Wouldn't have mattered. Keating was the senior surveyor, his word against mine." "So instead you decided to terrorize his widow after he died." Xavier's voice hardened. "Not the actions of an honest man, Darby. You don't understand what's at stake," Darby said, his tone shifting from defiance to something closer to desperation. "That map is worth a fortune. Simmons has buyers lined up, men who don't take disappointment well. If I don't deliver it..." He trailed off, the implications clear. "The Blackwater Gang," Xavier guessed. Darby's surprised expression confirmed it. "How did you..." "Doesn't matter. What matters is you're going to walk away from Mrs. Keating and whatever claim you think you have on her husband's property." Darby laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "You think it's that simple? Simmons will send others or come himself. He wants that map, and what Simmons wants he gets one way or another." Xavier released Darby's wrist but kept him pinned with a hard stare. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to go back to Simmons and tell him Mrs. Keating left town this morning, headed east toward Cheyenne. By the time he figures out you're lying, we'll be long gone." "And why would I do that?" Darby rubbed his wrist, eyes calculating. "Because if you cause any more trouble for Mrs. Keating, I'll make sure Simmons knows you've been skimming from his operations." Darby went pale. "I never..." "Doesn't matter if it's true," Xavier cut him off. "Men like Simmons don't need proof, just suspicion, especially when they're already angry about a failed job." The calculation in Darby's eyes turned to fear. "You're bluffing. Try me." Xavier's voice was soft but carried absolute conviction. "I've been tracking the Blackwater Gang for months. I know how they operate, and I know what they do to men who cross them or their business partners." A tense silence stretched between them. Finally, Darby's shoulders slumped. "Fine. I'll tell Simmons she headed east, but you'd better be gone by morning or it won't matter what I said." "We'll be gone," Xavier promised. "And Darby, if I ever hear you've gone after another woman the way you went after Mrs. Keating, I'll find you. That's a promise." Darby nodded jerkily and hurried away, casting nervous glances over his shoulder until he disappeared around a corner. Xavier watched him go, then headed into the hotel. He needed to get Clara ready to leave immediately. Waiting until morning wasn't an option anymore, not with Simmons and potentially the Blackwater Gang involved. Upstairs, he knocked on the door to room 12, identifying himself quietly. He heard movement inside, then the sound of the lock turning. Clara opened the door just enough to confirm it was him before letting him in. She'd been busy in his absence. Her borrowed dress had been altered with neat stitches to fit better, and a small bundle of provisions sat on the bed: bread, cheese, and dried meat, likely purchased from the hotel kitchen. "You're prepared," Xavier noted with approval. "I didn't survive 3 months after Thomas died by being helpless," Clara replied. There was a quiet dignity in her voice that Xavier found himself admiring. "Did you find what you were looking for?" More than I expected, Xavier admitted. And none of it good news. We need to leave now, not tomorrow, not tonight, now. Clara didn't waste time with questions. She simply nodded and began gathering her few possessions. What changed? Darby isn't working alone, Xavier explained, moving to the window to check the street below. He's employed by a man named Wade Simmons, who has connections to the very outlaws I've been tracking. They all want your map, and they're closing in. Clara's hands stilled momentarily as she wrapped bread in a cloth. The Blackwater Gang, I've heard stories. Most of them are true, Xavier said grimly. They're ruthless, efficient, and don't leave witnesses. If they're involved with Simmons and Simmons wants your map, we need to put as much distance between us and Silver Creek as possible before they realize we're gone. How will we leave without being seen? Clara asked, practical even in crisis. If Darby is watching the hotel, he was, but I've convinced him to deliver a false report to Simmons, said you'd headed east this morning. Xavier moved away from the window. Still, we shouldn't take chances. We'll leave through the back, head to the livery where my horse is stabled. I'll purchase a mount for you there. Clara finished packing her small bundle and tied it securely. I can ride, she said, answering Xavier's unasked question. Thomas taught me I'm not expert, but I can keep up. Good. The less time we spend in town, the better. They left the room quietly, Xavier leading the way down the back stairs that the hotel staff used. The afternoon was wearing on, shadows lengthening as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Perfect timing, they'd have enough daylight to put several miles between themselves and Silver Creek, but the approaching evening would help conceal their departure. At the livery stable, Xavier found the owner dozing on a stool. The man woke with a start when Xavier cleared his throat. Mr. Yates, he greeted him, then noticed Clara standing behind Xavier. His eyes widened slightly in recognition, but he made no comment. Need my horse saddled, Xavier said, and I'm looking to buy a mount for the lady, something steady but with endurance. The liveryman nodded thoughtfully. Got a bay mare might suit, not young, but she's trail-wise and doesn't spook easy. We'll take her, Xavier decided, not wanting to waste time haggling or comparing options, and we'll need provisions for a few days' hard riding. While the liveryman prepared the horses, Xavier collected his few belongings from the cot where he'd spent the previous night. His saddle bags contained extra ammunition, a small medical kit, and basic supplies enough to get by for a short time, but not for an extended journey. Where will we go? Clara asked quietly as they waited. Xavier considered the question. They couldn't head east as he'd told Darby to report, but they also couldn't go directly to the location on Clara's map. That would be the first place Simmons would look once he realized they'd fled. North, initially, he decided. Into the high country. There are old trapper cabins up there where we can lay low for a few days, then west, skirting around toward the canyon on your map, a longer route but safer. Clara nodded, accepting his strategy without argument. And the Blackwater Gang, you came here hunting them. They're still my priority, Xavier assured her. But right now, getting you to safety is part of that mission. If Simmons is working with them, finding out why he wants your map so badly might lead me to them. The liveryman returned with 2 saddled horses, Xavier's sturdy buckskin gelding and a bay mare that looked exactly as described, not young but clear-eyed and calm. She's called Penny, the liveryman said as Clara approached the mare cautiously. Gentle mouth, responds well to leg cues if you're not one for using the reins much. Clara stroked the horse's nose, receiving a soft nickering in response. She's perfect, thank you. Xavier paid for the mare and additional supplies, adding a bit extra for the liveryman's discretion. If anyone asks, ain't seen neither of you since yesterday, the man finished with a knowing nod. Godspeed, Mr. Yates. Madam. They mounted up and left town via a back trail that skirted the eastern edge of Silver Creek, then curved north into the foothills. Xavier set a steady pace, fast enough to put distance between them and pursuit, but not so grueling that the horses would tire quickly. Clara kept up admirably, her posture in the saddle revealing that she'd spoken truthfully about her riding abilities. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional call of birds preparing to roost for the night. Xavier kept alert, frequently checking behind them, but saw no sign of pursuit. As the sun began to set, painting the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Clara finally spoke. "I never thanked you properly," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still evening air, "for intervening yesterday, for everything since." Xavier glanced at her, noting how the fading light caught the auburn highlights in her hair. "No thanks needed. Couldn't very well stand by and watch a woman get shot in the street." "Many would have," Clara replied, "or would have walked away after that first intervention." "You didn't have to offer your room or food or protection." Xavier shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude he didn't feel he'd earned. "My mother raised me better than that." A small smile touched Clara's lips. "She must be a remarkable woman." "Was," Xavier corrected gently. "She passed when I was 19, influenza." "I'm sorry." The simple words carried genuine empathy. "It was a long time ago," Xavier said, though the ache of her absence had never fully faded. "She was remarkable, though, raised me alone after my father was killed in a mining accident. Taught me everything worth knowing, including that you judge a man by how he treats those who can't offer him anything in return." "She taught you well," Clara observed. After a moment, she added, "My mother died when I was young, too." "My father remarried quickly, a practical decision in a frontier town. My stepmother was cold but fair. She ensured I learned useful skills: cooking, sewing, household management. Never thought I'd be grateful for those lessons, but they've served me well since Thomas died." Xavier nodded, understanding what she wasn't explicitly saying. A woman alone on the frontier faced limited options, most of them unpleasant. Clara's domestic skills had likely spared her from the worst of those options. "How did you meet your husband?" he asked, guiding his horse around a rocky outcropping. A genuine smile warmed Clara's face at the memory. "He came to my father's store to purchase supplies for a survey expedition. Dropped an entire box of pencils and spent 10 minutes gathering them while turning redder than a sunset." Her voice softened. "He was so earnest, so different from the rough men I was used to. Came back every day for a week, buying things he didn't need just to talk to me. Sounds like a good man." "He was." Clara's expression turned wistful. "Not perfect, he could be absent-minded, so focused on his work that he'd forget to eat unless reminded. But kind, honest. He believed in building the future, connecting places and people." Her voice hardened slightly. "The railroad didn't deserve his loyalty." They rode on as twilight deepened into true night, the first stars appearing overhead. Xavier led them to a small clearing near a stream, sheltered by pine trees that would help mask any fire they built. "We'll rest here," he decided, dismounting and helping Clara down from her horse. "Not for long, a few hours at most. We should cover more ground before sunrise." Clara nodded, stretching muscles clearly unaccustomed to hours in the saddle. "I'll gather firewood. Stay within sight of camp," Xavier cautioned as he unsaddled the horses. "We're probably safe, but no sense taking chances." They worked efficiently, establishing a small camp with minimal conversation. Xavier built a fire while Clara organized their provisions, laying out a simple meal of jerky, hard cheese, and the bread she'd acquired at the hotel. As they sat by the fire eating, Xavier studied the map Clara had shown him earlier. "This canyon," he said, pointing to the marked location. "What did your husband's notes say about it?" Clara moved closer to see where he was indicating. "Thomas wrote that the vein was exposed along the eastern wall, visible only at certain times of day when the sun hit it directly. He estimated it was extensive, potentially running deep into the mountainside." Xavier traced the route with his finger. 2 days' ride from Silver Creek, following the main trail. But if we approach from the north, as I'm planning, it will take us 3, maybe 4 days." "Is it safe to go there at all?" Clara asked, "if Simmons wants the map so badly." "Eventually, he'll figure out where it leads," Xavier agreed. "But I'm hoping we'll have time to assess the situation before he or his men arrive. If the vein is as valuable as your husband believed, we need to know what we're dealing with." "And then what?" Clara's green eyes reflected the dancing firelight as she looked at him. "What happens after we find it?" It was a good question, one Xavier hadn't fully considered. His focus had been on immediate safety, on escaping Silver Creek before Simmons or the Blackwater Gang closed in. The longer-term plan remained hazy. "That depends partly on you," he said honestly. "It's your husband's discovery, your map. What do you want to do with it?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I don't know," she finally admitted. "When I found the map, I was just trying to keep it from Darby. I hadn't thought beyond that." "Gold brings trouble," Xavier observed. "Men like Simmons and the Blackwater Gang, they won't stop looking just because we've left town." "I know." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, though the night wasn't particularly cold. "Part of me wants to destroy the map, forget it exists, but another part thinks, this could be my chance. My chance to build something for myself, to never be at the mercy of others again." Xavier understood that desire all too well. Freedom, real freedom, required means, especially for a woman alone in the world. "We don't have to decide tonight," he said gently. "First, we make sure we're safe, then we see what your husband actually found. After that, we'll figure out the next step." Clara nodded, seeming satisfied with this approach. "You should rest," she suggested. "I'll take first watch." Xavier started to protest. He was accustomed to long nights without sleep, but something in her expression stopped him. This wasn't just about practicality, it was about her need to contribute, to be an equal partner in their escape rather than just someone being rescued. "Wake me in 3 hours," he agreed, settling his back against his saddle. "Sooner if you hear anything concerning." Clara nodded, drawing her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she positioned herself where she could see both the camp and the approach from the direction they'd come. Xavier closed his eyes, though he remained alert, listening to the night sounds around them, the soft nickering of the horses, the crackle of the fire, the distant call of a night bird. And underneath it all, the quiet presence of the woman keeping watch. He didn't expect to sleep deeply, but fatigue from the tension of the day overcame his usual vigilance. When Clara gently touched his shoulder to wake him, the position of the moon told him she'd let him sleep longer than the agreed 3 hours. "You should have woken me earlier," he said, sitting up and rubbing a hand over his face. "You needed the rest," she replied simply, "and I wasn't tired." Xavier didn't argue, recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw. Instead, he checked the horses while Clara settled down to sleep, using her bundle as a pillow and wrapping herself in the blanket he'd provided from his supplies. The night passed without incident. Xavier kept the fire burning low, more for comfort than warmth in the mild summer night. He spent the quiet hours considering their situation, planning routes and contingencies. Occasionally, his gaze would drift to Clara's sleeping form, noting the way the tension had eased from her face in slumber, making her look younger, more vulnerable. He woke her before dawn, when the eastern sky was just beginning to lighten. They broke camp quickly, leaving minimal evidence of their presence, and set off northward as the first golden rays of sunlight spilled over the horizon. The terrain grew more challenging as they climbed higher into the foothills, the trail narrowing and winding between stands of pine and aspen. Clara kept pace without complaint, though Xavier could tell the previous day's ride had left her sore. They spoke little, both conscious of the need to remain alert for any signs of pursuit. By midday, they had reached a high ridge that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. Silver Creek was visible in the distance, a collection of buildings nestled along the curve of the creek that gave the town its name. Xavier dismounted, reaching for his field glass to survey the landscape. "No obvious signs of riders following our trail," he reported after a thorough scan. "But that doesn't mean they're not coming." Clara joined him at the edge of the ridge, shading her eyes against the bright sun. "How far to these cabins you mentioned?" "Another few hours," Xavier estimated. "There's a network of them scattered through these mountains. Trappers used them during the winter months, left them open for travelers the rest of the year. Basic shelter, but better than sleeping rough." They continued their journey, the trail becoming steeper and less defined. In places, they had to dismount and lead the horses through narrow passages between rocky outcroppings. Clara handled the challenging terrain with quiet determination, never complaining even when scratches from branches left thin red lines on her arms. Late afternoon found them approaching a small plateau nestled between two higher peaks. A log cabin stood in a clearing, weathered by years of mountain winters but still solid. A small stream ran nearby, providing a reliable water source. "We'll stay here tonight," Xavier decided, dismounting and helping Clara from her horse. "It's defensible with good visibility of the approaches. If anyone's following, we'll see them coming." The cabin's interior was simple: a stone fireplace at one end, a rough-hewn table with two stools, and a narrow bed frame with a straw-filled mattress. Dust covered every surface, but otherwise, the shelter was in good condition. "Not exactly the Silver Creek Hotel," Xavier commented as they brought their supplies inside. Clara surprised him with a small laugh. "Better company, though." Xavier felt an unexpected warmth at her words. During their flight from Silver Creek and the long hours of riding, something had shifted between them, a tentative trust building from shared danger and close quarters. While Clara swept the worst of the dust from the cabin's interior, Xavier tended to the horses, ensuring they were securely picketed near the stream where they could graze on the lush mountain grass. He gathered firewood and filled their canteens with fresh water from the stream, all the while keeping a watchful eye on their surroundings. No signs of pursuit appeared on the horizon. As evening approached, Xavier allowed himself to relax slightly, though he kept his rifle within easy reach as he built a fire in the cabin's fireplace. Clara had laid out their provisions on the table, organizing what remained in practical portions. "We have enough for tomorrow," she reported. "After that, we'll need to hunt or find a trading post," Xavier nodded. "There's a settlement about half a day's ride west of here. Small place, mostly trappers and a few prospectors. We can resupply there if needed." They ate a simple meal as darkness fell outside. The fire cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls, creating an almost comfortable atmosphere despite the circumstances that had brought them there. "Tell me about the Blackwater Gang," Clara said suddenly. "Why are you tracking them?" Xavier paused, weighing how much to share. "They've been operating across Texas, New Mexico, and now Wyoming for the past year. Rob stagecoaches, trains, banks. They're organized, ruthless, don't leave witnesses. And your interest is professional. You mentioned the Rangers." "I was with the Rangers for 3 years," Xavier confirmed. "Left 6 months ago, but this is personal." Clara waited, not pressing but clearly interested. Xavier stared into the fire. "They killed 2 of my friends, good men, Rangers who were escorting a payroll shipment to El Paso. The Blackwaters hit the stage, shot everyone aboard. My friends, the driver, 3 passengers who were just in the wrong place." "I'm sorry," Clara said softly. "The Rangers are stretched thin, too many miles, too few men. The investigation was cursory, so I decided to hunt them myself." Xavier's voice hardened. "I've been following their trail since February. Silver Creek is the closest I've come to finding them." "And now you've been sidetracked by my troubles," Clara observed, guilt evident in her tone. Xavier shook his head. "Not sidetracked. If Simmons is doing business with the Blackwaters, your map might be the key to finding them. The question is why they'd be interested in a gold claim when their usual business is robbery." Clara considered this. "Perhaps they're looking to invest their stolen money. Or need a legitimate front for their operations. Maybe." Xavier wasn't convinced. "Or maybe there's something about this particular claim that makes it especially valuable, something beyond just gold." They discussed possibilities as they finished their meal, theories ranging from the practical to the unlikely. As the fire burned down to embers, the question of sleeping arrangements arose unspoken between them. "Take the bed," Xavier said, gesturing to the narrow frame against the wall. "I'll sleep by the fire." Clara looked like she might argue, but then nodded. "Thank you." As Xavier spread his bedroll on the floor near the fireplace, Clara settled onto the straw mattress, using her bundle as a pillow as she had the previous night. The cabin grew quiet except for the occasional pop of the dying fire and the soft sounds of night creatures outside. Xavier was nearly asleep when Clara spoke again, her voice so quiet he almost missed it. "I haven't slept properly in months," she confessed. "Not since Thomas died." too afraid of what might happen if I let my guard down. Xavier turned toward her voice in the darkness. You can rest tonight, I'm a light sleeper. A pause then. I believe you, 3 simple words, but the trust they conveyed meant something. Morning came with the sound of birdsong and sunlight streaming through the cabin's single window. Xavier woke first, moving quietly so as not to disturb Clara, who remained asleep on the narrow bed. He stepped outside to check the horses and survey their surroundings. The mountain air was crisp and clear, the rising sun illuminating peaks still capped with snow despite the summer season. No sign of human presence disturbed the pristine landscape. Xavier filled the canteens at the stream and gathered more firewood before returning to the cabin. Clara was awake, folding the rough blanket that had covered her during the night. She'd somehow managed to smooth her hair and straighten her dress, though Xavier knew she had few personal items with her. Good morning, she greeted him. Any signs of trouble? None. We seem to be alone up here. Xavier set about rekindling the fire. After we eat, we should discuss our next move. Over a breakfast of the last of their bread and some dried fruit, they studied the map together. Xavier traced potential routes with his finger, considering options. The direct path would take us here, he indicated, pointing to a valley that led toward the canyon marked on the map. But it's exposed, anyone following would spot us easily. What about this way? Clara suggested, tracing an alternative route that wound through more forested terrain. Xavier nodded appreciatively, slower going but better cover. Good thinking. They decided to rest at the cabin one more day, allowing their horses to recover from the steep climb and giving themselves time to ensure they weren't being pursued. Xavier spent the morning scouting the surrounding area while Clara remained at the cabin, rigging simple alarms from twine and tin cups that would alert them to anyone approaching. When Xavier returned around midday, he found Clara outside, washing her dress in the stream. She'd changed into what appeared to be a man's shirt, likely her husband's, brought with her from Silver Creek that hung nearly to her knees. She looked up as he approached, a flush coloring her cheeks. I hope you don't mind. It seemed a good opportunity to clean up. Of course not, Xavier replied, politely averting his eyes, though the oversized shirt covered her more completely than many proper dresses. I'll check the perimeter again, give you some privacy. No need, Clara said, wringing water from the fabric of her dress. I'm nearly finished. The dress should dry quickly in this sun. She hung the garment over a low branch, smoothing the fabric with careful hands. Xavier noticed that she'd mended the tear along the side with neat, even stitches. You're quite resourceful, he observed. Clara smiled slightly. Necessity. When Thomas was away on surveys, sometimes for weeks at a time, I learned to manage for myself. Her smile faded. Though I never imagined I'd be fleeing across mountains with a former Texas Ranger, pursued by outlaws interested in my husband's gold map. Life takes unexpected turns, Xavier agreed. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have predicted any of this either. They spent the afternoon making preparations for the next stage of their journey. Xavier cleaned and checked his weapons while Clara organized their remaining provisions and mended a tear in one of the saddle bags. They worked mostly in companionable silence, each respecting the other's competence at their tasks. As evening approached, Clara's dress had dried, and she disappeared briefly inside the cabin to change. When she emerged, Xavier had a fire going outside, preferring to cook in the open air where the smoke would dissipate more quickly. I found these while you were scouting this morning, Clara said, showing him a handful of wild onions and what appeared to be some kind of edible mushroom. They should improve our jerky somewhat. Xavier raised an eyebrow, impressed. You know your plants. My father taught me, Clara explained, kneeling beside the fire to arrange a cooking stone at its edge. He believed everyone should know which plants could feed you and which could kill you, said it might make the difference between survival and death someday. Wise man. Clara nodded, a distant look in her eyes. He was, difficult sometimes but wise. He didn't approve of Thomas at first, thought a surveyor was too unreliable a profession, but he came around eventually. And your father now, is he still in the picture? No, Clara said softly. He passed 3 years ago. Heart gave out suddenly one morning. My stepmother remarried and moved to California last year. Xavier recognized the familiar weight of her words, another person who understood what it meant to be truly alone in the world, without family to turn to in times of need. Their simple meal, enhanced by Clara's foraged additions, was surprisingly satisfying. As darkness settled over the mountains, they remained by the fire, the shared experience of the past 2 days creating a space for conversation that might otherwise have seemed too personal. "You never married?" Clara asked, breaking a comfortable silence. Xavier shook his head. "Came close once. Catherine was her name, daughter of a rancher near Austin." He poked at the fire with a stick, stirring embers that rose like fireflies into the night air. Her father didn't think a ranger was husband material. Too much danger, too little future in it. He wasn't wrong. What happened to her, married a banker from San Antonio, has 3 children now from what I hear. Xavier's tone was matter-of-fact without bitterness. "It was for the best. The life I've led since wouldn't have been fair to a wife." Clara studied him across the fire. "And now, what happens after you find the Blackwater Gang?" It was a question Xavier had asked himself many times over the months of his pursuit. Justice, if possible, revenge, if necessary. He met her gaze steadily. "After that?" "I haven't thought much beyond it. Perhaps you should," Clara suggested gently. "Vengeance is a poor foundation for a future." Xavier didn't respond immediately, struck by the quiet wisdom in her words. It was something his mother might have said, a perspective he'd lost sight of during the long months of his hunt. "Perhaps you're right," he finally acknowledged. "But first things first, we need to see what's in that canyon, then figure out how to keep you safe from Simmons and his associates." Clara nodded, accepting the change of subject. "Tomorrow, then." "Tomorrow," Xavier agreed. "We'll leave at first light." They extinguished the outside fire and retired to the cabin, falling into the same sleeping arrangement as the previous night without discussion. This time, however, Xavier found himself more aware of Clara's presence in the darkness, of the soft sound of her breathing as she drifted to sleep. Something was changing between them, a connection forming that went beyond their circumstances. Xavier wasn't sure what to make of it, or whether it was wise to acknowledge it at all. Their situation remained precarious, their futures uncertain, and yet, in the quiet of the mountain night, he found himself grateful for her company in a way that surprised him. Morning came with a light rain that dampened the earth and filled the air with the rich scent of wet pine and soil. They packed their belongings quickly, Clara donning her now clean dress while Xavier prepared the horses. By the time the sun had fully risen, they were on their way, following the winding forest path Clara had suggested. The day passed in steady travel, the terrain alternating between dense forest and open meadows bright with wildflowers despite the intermittent rain. They spotted deer and once, a black bear that regarded them warily before ambling away into the underbrush. The weather cleared by afternoon, leaving the landscape washed clean and vibrant. Xavier led the way, occasionally consulting the map to ensure they remained on course. Clara followed close behind, her riding having grown more confident with each day. They spoke little during the journey, both alert for any signs of pursuit or danger. By late afternoon, they had descended from the highest elevations and were traversing a series of rolling foothills that would eventually lead them to the canyon marked on Thomas Keating's map. Xavier called a halt in a protected hollow where a fallen tree provided natural shelter. "We'll rest here briefly," he decided, helping Clara dismount. "How are you holding up?" "Well enough," she replied, though he noted the stiffness in her movements as she stretched. "How much farther to the canyon?" Xavier consulted the map. "If we push on, we could reach it by nightfall." "But we'd have no daylight to examine what your husband found." Clara considered this. "Better to camp here then and approach in the morning when we can see properly." Xavier nodded his agreement. They established a simple camp, tethering the horses where they could graze on the lush grass. Clara gathered wood for a small fire while Xavier scouted the surrounding area, ensuring they were alone. When he returned, Clara had the fire burning low, with water heating for coffee. The domestic scene struck Xavier unexpectedly how quickly they had fallen into patterns of cooperation, anticipating each other's needs without discussion. "No signs of anyone for miles," he reported, accepting the tin cup of coffee she offered. "I think we've successfully evaded pursuit, at least for now." "What do you expect we'll find tomorrow?" Clara asked, settling beside him on the fallen log they were using as a bench. Xavier considered the question. "Hard to say. Your husband's notes mentioned a vein visible in the canyon wall, but beyond that," he shrugged. "If it's as valuable as Darby and Simmons believe, it could change your circumstances considerably." "Our circumstances," Clara corrected quietly. "You're involved now too, whether you intended to be or not." The inclusion struck Xavier our circumstances, not just hers. It acknowledged a partnership that had formed between them, unspoken but real. "I suppose I am," he agreed. After a moment he added, "Once we know what we're dealing with, we'll need to make some decisions." "About the claim about Simmons and the Blackwater Gang," Clara nodded, her expression serious in the fading light. "I've been thinking about that. If the gold is real and as extensive as Thomas believed, I don't want to spend my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for men like Darby or Simmons to find me." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not entirely sure yet," she admitted. "But perhaps there's a way to use the claim to draw them out to set a trap for the men you're hunting while resolving my situation as well." Xavier studied her with new appreciation. "That's dangerous thinking, Mrs. Keating, Clara," she corrected. "After everything we've been through, I think we can dispense with formalities, don't you, Clara?" he agreed, finding he liked the sound of her name on his lips. "And yes, it's dangerous but not without merit. The Blackwater Gang has proven difficult to track directly. Using the gold as bait might draw them into the open." They discussed possibilities as night fell completely, the stars emerging in brilliant clarity above the mountain landscape. The conversation ranged from practical considerations to more personal revelations as the hours passed. Xavier found himself sharing stories of his time with the Rangers that he'd never told anyone, while Clara spoke of her marriage to Thomas, both its joys and its challenges. "He was a good man," she said, staring into the fire's embers, "but distant sometimes. Lost in his work, in his visions of what the railroad could bring to these territories. I sometimes wondered if he remembered I was waiting for him to come home." "He was lucky to have you," Xavier observed. "Many women wouldn't have understood his passion for his work." Clara smiled sadly. "I understood it. I just wished sometimes that his passion for me was equally visible." She shook her head. "That sounds ungrateful. He provided well, was never unkind. Many women have far worse marriages." "Understanding someone's passion isn't the same as feeling appreciated," Xavier said quietly. "Both matter?" Clara looked at him with surprise, as if not expecting such insight. "Yes, they do." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither was ready to name. Finally, Clara broke the connection, rising to bank the fire for the night. "We should rest," she said. "Tomorrow may be eventful." They slept under the stars that night, the fallen tree providing sufficient shelter without the need to erect their small tent. Xavier took first watch, his rifle across his knees as he kept vigil over their small camp. Clara slept nearby, wrapped in her blanket, her face peaceful in the moonlight. When he woke her for her turn at watch, her hand caught his briefly as he passed her the rifle. A simple touch, but it lingered in his awareness as he settled into his bedroll. Morning dawned clear and bright, promising a warm day ahead. They broke camp efficiently and continued their journey, the terrain gradually changing as they approached the canyon. Pine forests gave way to more rugged landscape, with rocky outcroppings and scattered juniper trees clinging to the increasingly arid soil. By mid-morning, they could see the canyon in the distance, a great slash in the earth, its walls rising dramatically from the valley floor. According to Thomas Keating's map, the gold vein was located along the eastern wall, about halfway up. They approached cautiously, Xavier constantly scanning their surroundings for any sign of other human presence. The canyon appeared deserted, the only movement coming from birds circling lazily on thermal currents above the rim. "There," Clara said suddenly, pointing to a narrow trail that zigzagged up the canyon wall. That must be the path Thomas marked on his map. Xavier studied the trail with a critical eye. Steep going for the horses, we might need to leave them at the base and climb on foot. They found a sheltered location near a small spring to secure the horses, removing their saddles to allow them to rest comfortably. Xavier packed essential supplies into a single saddlebag, including water, food, and ammunition. Clara folded the map carefully and tucked it into her pocket, then tied back her hair with a strip of cloth. "Ready?" Xavier asked, offering her his hand. Clara nodded, her expression determined. "Ready?" The climb was challenging, but not impossible. The trail had clearly been used before, likely by prospectors or surveyors like Thomas Keating. In places, crude steps had been carved into the rock. In others, they had to pick their way carefully over loose shale and around boulders. Clara kept pace admirably, only occasionally accepting Xavier's offered hand at particularly steep sections. Her breathing came quick but steady, and her eyes remained focused on the path ahead rather than the increasing drop below. About halfway up the canyon wall, the trail widened slightly, creating a natural ledge that offered both a resting place and a spectacular view of the surrounding landscape. Xavier called a halt, offering Clara water from his canteen. "Your husband's directions indicate the vein should be visible from somewhere near here," he said, studying the rock face beside them. "But I don't see anything that looks like gold." Clara took a long drink of water, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Thomas wrote that it was only visible at certain times of day when the sun hit it directly. She looked up at the sky, gauging the sun's position. "It's still morning. Perhaps we need to wait." Xavier nodded, setting down the saddlebag and finding a relatively comfortable seat on a flat rock. Clara joined him, their shoulders nearly touching as they settled on the narrow perch. The view from their position was breathtaking, miles of wilderness stretching to the horizon, mountains rising in the distance, the valley floor a patchwork of forests and meadows. For a moment, Xavier allowed himself to simply appreciate the majesty of it, to set aside the urgency of their mission and the dangers that had driven them there. "It's beautiful," Clara murmured beside him, as if reading his thoughts. Thomas loved these wild places. Said he'd never felt closer to God than when standing on a mountainside, seeing the world spread out below. "I can understand that feeling," Xavier admitted. "There's a clarity up here that's hard to find elsewhere." They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching the shifting patterns of clouds and sunlight across the landscape. Xavier found himself acutely aware of Clara's presence beside him, the subtle scent of her skin, the way the breeze played with strands of hair that had escaped her simple tie, the warmth of her arm occasionally brushing his. "Xavier," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Look." He followed her gaze to the rock face beside them. As the sun's angle changed, light struck the stone directly, revealing what had been invisible before, a vein of quartz running through the darker stone, and within it, unmistakable glints of gold. Xavier stood, moving closer to examine the formation. The vein was substantial, running vertically for at least 20 feet and disappearing into the rock face on either end. He took out his knife and carefully chipped at a small section, revealing more of the precious metal embedded in the quartz. "Your husband was right," he said, turning to Clara with the sample in his palm. "This is no minor deposit. The vein likely extends deep into the mountain." Clara joined him, staring at the gold-flecked rock with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "So it's real, all of it." "The reason Darby was willing to shoot me in the street, why Simmons wants the map so badly." "Yes." Xavier returned the sample to his pocket and studied the surrounding area with new awareness. "And judging by the lack of recent tool marks or debris, we're the first to actually locate it since your husband." "What now?" Clara asked, her voice steady despite the magnitude of their discovery. Xavier considered their options. "We need to document the find properly, establish your claim legally. That means filing paperwork at the Territorial Land Office, which would alert Simmons immediately," Clara pointed out. "He'll have someone watching the land office records." "True." Xavier frowned, thinking through the implications. But without legal documentation, you have no protection if someone else discovers this location. Clara was silent for a moment, her gaze returning to the gold vein now clearly visible in the sunlight. "There's another option," she said slowly. "We could use this as bait, as we discussed last night, draw out Simmons and possibly the Blackwater Gang." Xavier studied her face, noting the resolve in her expression. "That's extremely risky, Clara. These men are killers." "I'm aware," she replied calmly. "But I'm tired of running, tired of being afraid, and you've been hunting these men for months. This might be our best chance to end all of it." The hour in her statement wasn't lost on Xavier. Somehow, in the space of just a few days, their separate missions had become intertwined, their futures connected in ways neither had anticipated. "If we do this," he said carefully, "we do it my way, with planning, preparation, and no unnecessary risks." Clara nodded. "Agreed. What do you propose?" They descended the canyon with a plan taking shape between them. Xavier would return to the settlement he'd mentioned earlier, a small outpost called Elkhorn, to gather information and send carefully worded messages that would reach both the territorial marshal and, indirectly, Wade Simmons. Clara would remain at a designated meeting point, safely hidden but within a day's ride of the canyon. "I don't like leaving you alone," Xavier admitted as they retrieved their horses and prepared to depart. "I'll be fine," Clara assured him. "The cabin you showed me on the map is well concealed, and I'm quite capable of defending myself." She patted the pocket of her dress, where Xavier had seen her tuck a small derringer earlier that morning. 3 days, Xavier said firmly. "If I'm not back by then, take the map and ride east to Cheyenne. Find Marshal Doyle, he knows me, will help you." Clara nodded, though her expression suggested she had no intention of leaving without him. 3 days. They rode together until the trail forked one path leading northwest toward Elkhorn, the other northeast to the trapper's cabin where Clara would wait. At the junction, they paused, both reluctant to separate despite the logic of their plan. "Be careful," Clara said, her green eyes serious as they met his. "Simmons sounds like a man with resources and few scruples." "I've dealt with worse," Xavier assured her, though in truth, he was more concerned about leaving her alone than about his own safety. "Stay alert. Don't trust anyone who approaches the cabin." Clara nodded, then surprised him by reaching across the space between their horses and touching his hand. "I'll be waiting." The simple statement carried weight beyond its words. Xavier turned his hand to grasp hers briefly, a connection that said more than either was ready to express aloud. 3 days, he repeated, then released her hand and turned his horse toward Elkhorn, forcing himself not to look back until he'd crested the next rise. When he did, Clara was already out of sight, the fork in the trail empty in the afternoon sun. Elkhorn proved to be exactly as Xavier had described, a small collection of rough buildings serving the trappers, prospectors, and occasional travelers who passed through the area. A single street ran through the center of the settlement, with a general store, a saloon, and a few other establishments catering to basic needs. Xavier arrived as evening was approaching, the lengthening shadows casting the dusty street in golden light. He made his way to the saloon first, reasoning it would be the best place to gather information without drawing undue attention to himself. The interior was dim and smoky, with a handful of patrons scattered at tables or standing at the rough-hewn bar. Conversations paused briefly as Xavier entered, resuming after the quick assessment that determined he wasn't immediately threatening. He ordered whiskey from the bartender, a burly man with an impressive beard and arms thick as tree trunks. As the man poured, Xavier casually asked if there was somewhere he could send a telegram. "Nearest telegraph is in Benton, 2 days' ride southwest," the bartender informed him. "But Hank over there," he nodded toward an older man in the corner, "rides to Benton every week with mail. He's heading out tomorrow morning if you've got something needs sending." Xavier thanked him and, drink in hand, made his way to Hank's table. The older man looked up with rheumy eyes, assessing Xavier with the practiced gaze of someone who'd seen all types come and go through frontier settlements. "Heard you might be heading to Benton tomorrow," Xavier said by way of greeting. "I'd appreciate it if you could deliver a message for me. Happy to make it worth your while." Hank gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit yourself down then, who you needing to reach?" Xavier settled into the chair, placing his drink on the scarred table surface. "Two messages, actually. One official, one less so." Hank's eyebrows rose, but he nodded. $15 for the pair, half now, half when I get back with any replies. It was steep, but Xavier hadn't expected charity. He counted out the money and slid it across the table. "First message is for Territorial Marshal Doyle in Cheyenne. Tell him Xavier Yates has located the Blackwater Gang's next target and requests assistance at Keating Canyon 3 days from now." Hank's eyes widened slightly at the mention of the notorious gang, but he simply nodded. "And the second? This one's trickier," Xavier admitted. "I need word to reach Wade Simmons in Silver Creek, but indirectly. Can you manage that?" "Might be able to," Hank allowed, curiosity evident in his expression. "What's the message?" "Tell him a prospector in Elkhorn is offering information about the Keating widow and her map for the right price." Xavier slid another bill across the table. "This part's important. Make sure it gets to him through channels that can't be traced back to you or me." Hank pocketed the additional money with a nod. "I know how to spread word that finds its mark without showing the hand that cast it. Consider it done." Xavier spent the rest of the evening gathering supplies and information. He purchased ammunition, food provisions, and a few other necessities from the general store, careful not to reveal too much about his plans or companions. From casual conversations at the saloon, he learned that riders matching the description of the Blackwater Gang had indeed been seen in the area within the past week, confirming his suspicion that Simmons was working with them in some capacity. He took a room above the saloon for the night, though he slept little, his mind occupied with their plan and its potential pitfalls. And he had to admit, with thoughts of Clara alone in the trapper's cabin, waiting for his return, morning brought clear skies and a sense of purpose. Xavier confirmed with Hank that both messages would be delivered as discussed, then purchased a few final items from the general store before saddling his horse and heading back toward the meeting point. The journey seemed longer than it had in the opposite direction, each mile stretching his patience as concern for Clara's safety grew. He pushed his horse harder than was wise on the mountain trails, arriving at the cabin by late afternoon of the second day since their separation. Smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, a good sign that Clara was inside and well enough to maintain a fire. Still, Xavier approached cautiously, alert for any indication of trouble or unwelcome visitors. He was still 20 yards from the door when it opened, and Clara stepped out, rifle in hand. When she recognized him, her face broke into a smile that transformed her features, erasing the wariness and replacing it with undisguised joy. "You're back early," she called, lowering the rifle. Xavier dismounted, leading his horse the remaining distance. Elkhorn was cooperative for once. "Everything goes smoothly here," Clara nodded, her eyes taking in his appearance as if checking for injuries or signs of trouble. "Not a soul has passed by. I've kept watch as we agreed." Only when he reached the cabin did Xavier realize how tense he'd been during their separation. The sight of Clara safe, competent, clearly pleased to see him released something in his chest he hadn't acknowledged was tight. "I brought supplies," he said, beginning to unload his saddlebags. "And I sent the messages. If all goes as planned, Marshal Doyle and his deputies will be approaching Keating Canyon the day after tomorrow. And Simmons will have received word about a prospector in Elkhorn with information to sell about you and your map." Clara helped him carry the supplies inside, where he found the cabin noticeably improved from when they'd left it. She'd cleaned thoroughly, arranged their limited belongings with practical efficiency, and even gathered wildflowers for a small jar on the table. "You've been busy," Xavier observed, noting these domestic touches with surprise. Clara shrugged, a hint of color touching her cheeks. "I needed something to occupy my hands while my mind was." She trailed off, then finished more carefully while I was waiting. The admission hung between them, neither acknowledging fully what it might mean. Instead, they focused on practical matters, reviewing their plan, discussing contingencies, preparing for the confrontation that would likely come at Keating Canyon. Over a simple but satisfying dinner of rabbit stew, Clara had set snares during her wait and proven herself an able hunter. Xavier shared what he'd learned in Elkhorn about the Blackwater Gang's presence in the area. "So they are working with Simmons," Clara concluded, her expression thoughtful. "But to what end? Surely they're not interested in legitimate mining operations." "I've been considering that," Xavier said. "The timing is suspicious. The gang has been focusing on stage robberies and bank jobs. Why suddenly take an interest in a gold claim? Unless what?" Xavier frowned, piecing together fragments of information. "Unless they're planning something bigger, something that requires a legitimate presence in the area as cover." Clara's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "The railroad payroll," she said. "Thomas used to mention when large shipments were coming through, funds for workers, equipment, land purchases. The summer payment would be due soon." "How large are these shipments?" Xavier asked. "Enormous. Tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes more." Clara shook her head. "Thomas said they were the most stressful days for the company officers, all that money moving through relatively unsecured territory." Xavier nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place. "So the Blackwater Gang partners with Simmons, establishes a presence at a legitimate gold claim as cover, then hits the payroll shipment. They'd have the perfect hideout afterward, remote, defensible, and with a seemingly legitimate reason for being there. And Simmons gets a share of the robbery proceeds plus a gold mine," Clara added. "No wonder he was so desperate to find the map." The implications were sobering. If they were right, the stakes had just increased substantially. They weren't just dealing with a dispute over a gold claim anymore, but potentially interfering with a major robbery plan. "We need to adjust our approach," Xavier decided. "If the gang is planning to hit the payroll shipment, they'll be more heavily armed and in greater numbers than we anticipated." Clara nodded, her expression serious but not fearful. "What do you suggest?" They spent the evening revising their plan, accounting for this new understanding of their adversaries' intentions. By the time they settled for sleep, Xavier again, insisting Clara take the cabin's narrow bed while he made do with his bedroll near the fire, they had a strategy that balanced risk with reasonable caution. Morning would bring the beginning of their counteroffensive, a carefully orchestrated plan to expose the Blackwater Gang's intentions while ensuring Clara's legal claim to her husband's discovery was protected. As Xavier stared into the dying embers of the fire, he found himself reflecting on how completely his mission had transformed in just a few days. What had begun as a solitary pursuit of justice for his fallen comrades had become something more complex and perhaps more meaningful through his unexpected alliance with Clara Keating. And if he was honest with himself, it wasn't just their missions that had become intertwined. Something deeper was developing between them, something he hadn't sought but couldn't deny. The question was whether either of them would acknowledge it before their dangerous gambit played out. Dawn broke with the promise of another clear day. They rose early, preparing with the focused efficiency of people who understand the gravity of what lies ahead. Clara had altered her dress again, making it more practical for riding and movement, while Xavier checked and rechecked his weapons. They departed the cabin by mid-morning, leaving it as they had found it, any evidence of their presence carefully erased. The ride to Keating Canyon would take most of the day, with their plan calling for them to arrive late afternoon, enough daylight remaining to establish positions, but close enough to evening that anyone following would have limited visibility. They rode mostly in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what awaited them. The landscape shifted gradually from the forested mountains to more arid terrain as they approached the canyon, the June sun warm on their backs. About 2 miles from the canyon, Xavier guided them to a secluded overlook that provided a view of the approaching trails without exposing their position. "We'll wait here for a time," he decided, helping Clara dismount. "Watch for any signs of Simmons or his men." They secured the horses in a natural enclosure formed by boulders and sparse trees, then settled in positions that allowed them to observe while remaining hidden. Xavier passed his field glass to Clara, who scanned the distant trails with careful attention. "Nothing yet," she reported, handing the glass back to him. "But if your message reached Simmons yesterday, he could be close." Xavier nodded, continuing his own surveillance. "Marshal Doyle won't arrive until tomorrow at the earliest, assuming he received my message and believed it worth responding to. Which means we're on our own until then," Clara concluded, "at least initially." "Yes," Xavier turned to face her directly. "It's not too late to change the plan. We could ride east now, reach Cheyenne in 3 days, file your claim properly with legal protection." Clara shook her head, determination evident in every line of her face. "No, Simmons and the Blackwater Gang would still come after us. Better to face them here, on ground we've chosen with preparation." Xavier studied her, struck again by her courage. Many women and men, for that matter, would have opted for the safer path, the one with fewer immediate risks. Clara's willingness to stand her ground spoke to a strength of character that continued to impress him. "Very well," he agreed. "But remember your promise at the first sign that things are going badly, you ride for the meeting point we established. No heroics." Clara's lips curved in a slight smile. "I believe you're the former Texas Ranger between us, Mr. Yates. Heroics seem more your domain than mine." The teasing note in her voice lightened the moment, though the seriousness of their situation remained. They continued their surveillance for another hour, seeing nothing to indicate pursuit or other human presence in the area. Finally, Xavier made the decision to proceed to the canyon. "We'll approach from the western side," he said as they mounted up. "It's less exposed, and there's better cover for the horses." They reached the canyon as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. The gold vein wouldn't be visible at this time of day, a fact that worked in their favor, as anyone searching for it would need to wait for the proper light conditions. Xavier led them to a position near the base of the canyon wall, where a tumble of boulders created natural fortifications and concealment for their horses. They established a small camp, careful to keep the fire minimal and well shielded to prevent its light from being visible from a distance. As darkness fell, Xavier outlined the final details of their plan. "I'll take first watch from that ridge." He indicated a position about 50 yards away that offered good visibility of the approaches. 4 hours, then we switch. At first light, we move to positions overlooking the trail to the gold vein. Clara nodded, checking the derringer in her pocket and the rifle Xavier had insisted she keep close. "And if Simmons arrives before the marshal, we observe only unless forced to engage," Xavier replied. "The goal is to confirm the connection between Simmons and the Blackwater Gang, learn what we can about their plans for the railroad payroll, then bring in Marshal Doyle to make arrests." It was a solid plan in theory, though both recognized the many ways it could go wrong in practice. The Blackwater Gang hadn't survived and thrived by being predictable or easily captured.